Hasidism in Medieval Germany, Major Trends in Jewish Mysticism by Gershom G. Scholem. In the writings of Eliezer of Worms, the most faithful of Yehuda's disciples. Discourses on the essence of Hasidut are to be found side by side with tracts on magic and the effectiveness of God's secret names. In one case, even in the same book, there one also finds the oldest extant recipes for creating the golem, a mixture of letter magic and practices obviously aimed at producing ecstatic states of consciousness. It would appear as though in the original conception of the golem came to life only while the ecstasy of his creator lasted. The creation of the golem was, as it were, a particularly sublime experience felt by the mystic, who became absorbed in the mysteries of the alphabetic combinations described in the Book of Creation. It was only latter that the popular legend attributed to the golem an existence outside the ecstatic consciousness, and in latter centuries a whole group of legends sprang up around such golem figures and their creators. Well, thought forms, egregors, various things along that lines are pretty much a universal thing, aren't they? Obscurity still surrounds the question how far a certain form of magic was also involved in the prayer mysticism of the Hasidim, which contemporary authors already regarded as particularly characteristic of their faith. Jacob ben Asher, whose father came to Spain from Germany, says on this subject, the German Hasidim were in the habit of counting or calculating every word in the prayers, benedictions, and hymns, and they sought a reason in the Torah for the number of words in the prayers. The other words, this mysticism of prayer, originates not from the spontaneous prayer of the devotee, but from a study of the classical liturgy, whose text was largely fixed by tradition. It is essentially not a new form of devotion, but mystical speculation concerning the background of an already firmly established tradition. Here and elsewhere in the literature of the Hasidim, prominence is given for the first time to certain techniques of mystical speculation, which are popularly supposed to represent the heart and core of Kabbalism, such as gematria, i.e. the calculation of the numerical value of Hebrew words and the search for connections with other words or phrases of equal value. Dotarikon are interpretation of the letters of a word as abbreviations of whole sentences, and Temura are interchange of letters according to certain systematic rules. As a matter of historical fact, none of these techniques of mystical exegesis can be called Kabbalism in the strict sense of the word. In the literature of the classical Kabbalah, during the 13th and 14th centuries of the Common Era, they often played a very minor part. The few important Kabbalists who made more marked use of them, such as Jacob ben Jacob Hakohen or Abraham Abulafia, were clearly influenced by the German Hasidim. What really deserves to be called Kabbalism has very little to do with these Kabbalistic practices. The Hasidic literature on the subject of prayer is comprehensive and to a large extent still in our hands. It shows that the number of words which constituted a prayer and the numerical values of words, parts of sentences, and whole sentences were linked not only with biblical passages of equal numerical value, but also with certain designations of God and the angels and other formulas. Prayer is linked to Jacob's ladder, extended from the earth to the sky. It is therefore conceived as a species of mystical ascent, and it appears in many of these explanations as a highly formalized process, full of hidden aspects and purposes. But while we know a great deal about the external technique of these mysteries of prayer, as the Hasidim called them, we are in the dark as regards to the real meaning, the functional purpose of these mystical numerologies. Were certain meditations meant to go with certain prayers, or does the emphasis lie on the magical influence of prayer? In the former case, we should be dealing with what the Kabbalah since 1200 referred to as kawana, literally intention, i.e. the mystical meditation on the words of prayer while they are being spoken. Kawana, in other words, is something to be realized in the act of prayer itself. Now, among the German Hasidim, this fundamental doctrine of Kabbalistic mysticism of prayer does not yet occur. Eliezer of Worms, in his great commentary on the prayers, makes no mention of it, and where in another context he refers in passing to a conception of kawana which comes close to the Kabbalistic one, a fact which I shall discuss later. It is clear that this concerns not particular words, but the whole of the prayer. As to how the Hasidim themselves interpreted the use of the above-mentioned mysteries, I have been unable to come to a final conclusion, but it is plain that this mysticism of prayer stands in opposition to the old Merkabah mysticism. The emphasis is no longer on the approach of the mystic himself to God's throne, but on that of his prayer. It is the word, not the soul, which triumphs over the fate and evil. The enormous concern shown for the use of the correct phrase in the traditional texts and the excessive pedantry displayed in this regard reveals a totally new attitude towards the function of words, where the Merkabah mystics sought spontaneous expression for their oceanic feeling in the prodigal use of words. The Hasidim discovered a multitude of esoteric meanings in a strictly limited number of fixed expressions, and this painstaking loyalty to the fixed term does indeed seem to go hand in hand with a renewed consciousness of the magic power inherent in words. As to when and how this mysticism of prayer, or as one should perhaps say magic of prayer, first originated, the texts tell us nothing. Certainly it did not originate solely among the Hasidim, although all our knowledge is derived from these sources. A consensus of traditions handed down by the disciples of Yehuda the Hasid determines the new mysticism as the final link in a chain which reaches back through the Eminence to Italy, and from there to Aaron of Baghdad, whose name has already been mentioned. Certain intermediate links in the chain may appear dubious, but in its essence, the view that the mysteries of prayer were brought in Germany from Italy, perhaps in a more primitive form, seems controvertible. Eliezer of Worms tells us that when the father of Samuel the Hasid, our Calonimus, died around 1126, his son was too young to be told the secret by his father in accordance with the traditional family usage. For this reason, another scholar at the time, leader of prayers in the Spire community, was entrusted by him with the mission of initiating the boy when he had grown up. This shows quite clearly that the origins of the secret doctrine go back beyond the period of the Crusades. Whether they lay in Babylonia and spread from there to Italy simultaneously, perhaps, with the already declining Merkabah mysticism, must remain a matter for conjecture. At any rate, there can be little doubt that the Kabbalistic mysticism of prayer, though its own subsequent development was entirely different, was taken over from the Hasidim. The combination of ecstaticism and magic already noted the characteristics of Merkabah mysticism reappears on a new plane in this mysticism of prayer. As to whether it determined the theory of prayer, it is only possible to guess. In other respects, its influence is plain. Moses Taku of Takau, a follower of Jehuda the Hasid, who set himself to defend the undiluted doctrine of Talmudic Judaism, if necessary even against the teachings of its own master, has given an account of such practices of which he strongly disapproved, and which he did not hesitate to condemn as heretical. They set themselves up as prophets by practicing the pronunciation of holy names, or sometimes they only direct their intention upon them without actually pronouncing the words. Then a man is seized by terror and his body sinks to the ground. The barrier in front of his soul falls. He himself steps into the center and gazes into the faraway, and only after a while, when the power of the name recedes, does he awaken and return, with a confused mind, to his former state. This is exactly what the magicians do who practice the exorcism of the demons. Is it the exorcism or the possession of the demons? Now, some of that stuff's not direct permission. You give permission for something else, and then something else says, "No, I'm playing a role this time." You know, they conjure one from their midst with unclean exorcisms in order that he may tell them what he has perhaps been happening in a faraway country. The conjurer falls down on the ground where he was standing, and his veins become cramped and stiffed, and he is as one dead, but after a while he rises without consciousness and runs out of the house. And if one does not hold him at the door, he would break his head and his limbs. Then when he again becomes a little conscious of himself, he tells them what he has seen. It is well known how widespread such manifestations of the abnormal metaphysic life were during this period among the Christians in whose midst the Hasidim passed their life. A book like Joseph Goer's is voluminous, Christlich, Mystic, is a veritable thesaurus of instances in this genre, but that the Jewish mystics also attached the very greatest importance to such direct contact with the psychic world is clearly proved by the example of Jacob Halevi of Marvij around 1200 of the Common Era, who seems to have belonged to a Hasidic circle. He has left us a whole collection of responses from heaven, i.e. judgments on controversial questions of rabbinic law, which were revealed to him as answers to dream questions. Shiloth, Halom, the asking of such questions was an extremely widespread magical practice for which we have hundreds of recipes, while there were scholars who disparaged the solution of halakhic problems on the basis of direct revelation instead of Talmudic casuistry. There were also many others who admired and imitated the practice. Indeed, the thing is as characteristic of the attitude of many followers of Hasidim towards the halakha as it is dubious from the point of view of strict Talmudist. 7. The new religious spirit, which finds expression in the ideal of the Hasid, permeates every domain of traditional Jewish mysticism and theosophy and tries, albeit awkwardly and unsystematically, to transform them. This effort includes attempts to give a new interpretation to the Merkabah. Jehuda the Hasid relates to his pupil Eliezer how, when he was once standing in the synagogue with his father, and there was a bowl with water and oil before them, his father drew his attention to the incomparable radiance which the light of the sun produced on the surface of the liquid, and said to him, "Fix your attention on this radiance, for it is the same as the radiance of the Hashmal, one of the personified objects of Ezekiel's Merkabah vision." We have seen how the new tempter transformed the old spirit of prayer, but it also opened new spheres of religious experience, important in spite of all the doubts that they may raise in the minds of latter generations, such as the theory and practice of penance, which here first in the development of Jewish mysticism acquired vehement force. Hitherto, penance had not been of paramount importance to the mystics. Now it became the central fact of their existence, in the place of the heavenly journey of the self-absorbed ecstatic, and parallel to the new emphasis laid on the now enormously important act of prayer. The technique of penitence was developed into a vast and elaborate system until it became one of the cornerstones of true Hasidut. It is important to realize that previously an elaborate casuistry of penitential acts corresponding to every conceivable degree of transgression had been almost unknown among Jews. Because that's closer to priestly control than, some general ideas and, varying per the circumstance and not being part of some vicarious system, right? Of course, Judaism set the priest up in a little bit higher a position than you would expect from monotheism, but the Hasidim were thus not restricted by traditional obstacles when they undertook the task of formulating a ritual of penance that was entirely in accordance with the new spirit they represented. Here we are again undoubtedly faced with the after effects of Christian influence. The whole system of penitence, particularly in the codified form given to it by Eleazar of Worms in several of his writings, closely corresponds to the practices prescribed by the early medieval church in its literature on the subject, the penitentiary books. And some of this was to sell indulgences and stuff like this, but it doesn't sound like we're going along those lines, are we? Among the latter, the Celtic and latter, the Frankish tracts developed a peculiar system of which the understanding is pertinent to our subject. Penitence is conceived as reparation for an insult to God through a personal act of restitution, the sinner undertaking to perform certain well-defined acts of a penitentiary character, a conception which inevitably led to the establishment of what can only be described as a tariff of penance. These forcible cures and powerful remedies, of which the history of ecclesiastical penance were full, were doubtless suited to the comprehension of the recently Christianized Celts and Germans, and accorded well with their primitive notions of justice, especially in the case of the Franks. But the point to be noted here is that they were also taken over by the Hasidim and adapted to the Jewish milieu. Although after the Gregorian reform of the Church in the 11th century, Rome opened a fight against the old penitentiary books, their authority remained unshaken among wide circles during the whole period of the Crusades. At a time, that is to say, when the Jewish communities in Germany were themselves under the influence of a mood favorable to their adoption, authority could easily be ascribed to them by pointing to some scattered analogies in the older Jewish literature. In this manner, it became possible to justify the adoption of a whole system of penitence, beginning with all sorts of fastings and leading through various acts, frequently of a highly bizarre nature, to the supreme punishment of voluntary exile, an act of penitence already known to the Talmud. Generally speaking, the system is developed in the Sefer Hasidim and conserved in the moral literature of latter generations, distinguishes between four categories of penitence. In its mildest form, penitence simply meant that the opportunity for committing the same sin again was not utilized. Teshuvah haba, penitence, could also amount to a system of voluntary restraints and the preventative avoidance of all occasions calculated to tempt one into committing a certain sin. Teshuvah hagader, thirdly, the amount of pleasure derived from committing a sin could be made the criterion of the self-imposed ascesis. Teshuvah hameshkal. Lastly, in the case of transgressions forbidden under pain of death by the Torah, the sinner must undergo tortures as bitter as death, often amounting to extravagantly painful and humiliating punishments in order to obtain divine forgiveness and avoid the extermination of the soul, which the Torah threatens for certain sins. Teshuvah hakatuv. In regard to these practices, we have the evidence, not only the Hasidic writings, whose exhortations might be dismissed as belonging purely to the realm of theory, but also of a good many accounts of actual happenings through which the fame of the German Hasidim soon spread far and wide. These stories, of which there are many, leave no doubt about the spirit of fanatical earnestness which animated the zealots. To sit in the snow or in the ice for an hour daily in winter, or to expose one's body to ants and bees in the summer, was judged a common practice among those who followed the new call. It is a far cry from the Talmudic conception of penitence to these novel ideas and practices. A story like the following is characteristic of the new mode. A Hasid was in the habit of sleeping on the floor in summer, among the fleas, and placing his feet into a bucket with water in winter, until they froze into one lump with the ice. A pupil asked him, "Why do you do that? Since man is responsible for his life, do you expose yourself to certain danger?" The Hasid replied, "It is true that I have not committed any deadly sin, and though I am surely guilty of lighter transgressions, there is no need for me to expose myself to such tortures. But it is said in the Midrash that the Messiah is suffering for our sins, as it is said, Isaiah 53:5. He is wounded for our transgressions, and those who are truly just take sufferings upon themselves for their generation. But I do not want anyone but myself to suffer for my sins. And in fact, the people who, after the death of his teacher, is perturbed by the thought that his death might have been due to his ascetic sufferings, and that he may now be punished for it, has a dream revelation in which he learns that his master has attained to an infinitely high place in heaven. In the same manner, we are told by the Kabbalist Isaac of Acre in the 14th century, the Common Era, I have heard tell of a Hasid in Germany who was not a scholar but a simple and honest man, that he once washed away the ink from a strip of parchment in which there were written prayers which included the name of God. When he learned that he had sinned against the honor of God's name, he said, I've despised God's honor, therefore I shall not think higher of my own. What did he do? Every day during the hour of prayer, when the congregation entered and left the synagogue, he lay down on the doorstep, and old and young passed over him, and if one trod on him, whether deliberately or by accident, he rejoiced and thanked God. Thus he did for a whole year, taking as his guide the saying of the Mishnah, the wicked will be judged in hell for 12 months. Long afterwards, the responses of German rabbis still bear testimony to the powerful influence of Hasidic morality, as when Jacob Weil prescribes detailed penances for an adulterous young woman, or Israel Bruna for a murderer. There is, however, one important respect in which Hasidism differs sharply from its Christian contemporaries. It does not enjoin sexual asceticism. On the contrary, the greatest importance is assigned in the Sefer Hasidim to the establishment and maintenance of normal and reasonable marital life. Nor is penitence extended to sexual abstinence and marital relations. The asceticism of the typical Hasid concerns solely his social relations towards women, not the sexual side of his married life. 8. Turning to the influence which Hasidism as a whole has exercised upon the Jews of Germany, one finds that its practical side, i.e., the new morality, the system of penitence, and the mysticism of prayer, have held their own much longer than the theological and theosophical ideas and the conception of God expounded in the writings of Jehuda the Hasid and his disciples. With the gradual infiltration since the 14th century of a more highly developed system of thought, the Kabbalism of Spain, the early Hasidic theosophy lost ground, and in time, albeit never completely, relinquished its hold on those Jewish circles, which were at all concerned with theological questions. Nevertheless, an understanding of the Hasidism also requires an analysis of these theosophical ideas, of which the literature of the 13th and 14th century is full, and here one is immediately forced to recognize the existence of a new religious mood with a strong tendency towards pantheism, or at least a mysticism of divine eminence. In the literature with which we are concerned, this element is combined with agadic traditions, with remnants from the heritage of Merkaba mysticism, sometimes in a new guise, and above all with the constantly influential theology of Saadia. In the case of some cases of these representations and transformations of theosophical ideas, some doubt remains both as regards to their origin and their rabbinical orthodoxy. Now and then, when they become entangled in mystical brooding, it seems as though these pious and naive medieval Jewish devotees unconsciously drew upon the religious heritage of heretics and sectarians. One even finds tendencies towards a kind of logos doctrine. The God of the old pre-Hasidic mystics was the holy king who, from his throne in the Empyrean, listens to the listens to the ecstatic hymns of his creatures. The living relationship of these mystics to God rested upon the glorification of certain aspects of the divinity, its solemnity, the absence of everything profane, and even its immensity and overwhelmingness. In contradistinction to this picture, German Hasidism now develops a different conception of God which poignantly contrasts with the older one. The Hasidim like to employ Sa'diya's terminology in order to describe the pure spirituality and the immeasurable infiniteness of God. Two aspects of his being on which they lay the greatest emphasis. To these attributes was added a third which, like the two others, played no part in the mysticism of the Merkaba period, namely God's omnipresence, which in turn imperceptibly acquired the character of an eminence not easily reconciled with the super-mundane transcendence of the Creator. Another Hasidic article of faith, as the idea is finally developed by the outstanding representatives of the new school, God is not so much the master of the universe as its first principle and prime mover. Side by side with its new conception, the earlier belief seems to linger on as though by force of tradition. The new conception is formulated by Eliezer of Worms in a significant passage where he says, God is omnipresent and perceives the just and the evildoers. Therefore, when you pray, collect your mind. For it is said, I always place God against myself. And therefore the beginning of all benedictions runs, Praise be to thee, O God, as though a man speaks to a friend. No Merkabah mystic would have given this interpretation of the thee with which God is addressed. More than that, the change between the second and third persons in the formula of the benedictions, Praise be to thee, who has blessed us, is quoted as proof that God is at once the nearest and the farthest, the most plainly revealed and the most completely hidden of all. God is even closer to the universe and the man than the soul is to the body. This doctrine, propounded by Eliezer of Worms and accepted by the Hasidim, closely parallels Augustine's thesis, so often approvingly quoted by the Christian mystics of the 13th and 14th centuries, that God is closer to any of his creatures than the latter to itself. In its most uncompromising form, this doctrine of God's Eminence is expressed in the Song of Unity, a hymn composed by a member of the inner circle around Jehuda the Hasid, who seems to have written a commentary to it, which gives an impressive version of Sa'diya's conception of God. Thus we read, Everything is in thee, and thou art in everything. Thou fillest everything, and dost encompass it. And when everything was created, thou wast in everything. Before everything was created, thou wast everything. Expressions of this sort reoccur in every kind of Hasidic writing, as Bloch has shown. They are nothing but enthusiastic embellishments of the idea of divine omnipresence as set out in the old Hebrew paraphrase of Sa'diya's Magnum Opus. But from where are they taken? Whose spirit do they reflect? One is tempted to think of John the Scot, called Scotus Erigena, the great light of Neoplatonic mysticism in the 9th century of the Common Era. His influence was immense and could very well have extended to Jewish circles in Provence, where, according to some scholars, the above-mentioned paraphrase of Sa'diya seems to have originated. It is well known that writers from these circles drew heavily upon early sources of Latin scholasticism. And indeed it is the spirit of John the Scot which is reflected in such formulae as those that I have quoted. Nobody would be surprised if they closed with the words, For thou shalt be everything in everything, when there shall be nothing but thee alone, words which are actually a transposition into direct speech of a sentence taken from John the Scot's book on the division of nature. Not infrequently, the idea of imminence is given a naturalistic twist, as when Moses, as Zariel, a 13th century Hasid, defines it as thus: He is one in the cosmic ether, for he fills the whole ether and everything in the world, and nowhere is there a barrier before him. Everything is in him, and he sees everything, for he is entirely perception through he. Though he has no eyes, for he has the power to see the universe within his own being. Some of these passages have been taken literally from Sa'diya's commentary to the Sefer Yetzirah, which he refers in very naturalistic terms, to God's life as a positive attribute of his being. Here it should be remarked in passing that this widespread doctrine of divine eminence, which clearly corresponded to the deepest religious feeling of the Hasidim, had already been criticized sharply by a disciple of Yehuda the Hasid. Moses Teku expressed the fear that this pantheistic element in the conception of the divinity might be used as a justification of paganism. Not entirely sure what they mean by that, but since it made it possible for the heathen, yeah, they're just referring to outsiders, they don't mean those terms literally, I guess, to argue that they were serving the Creator with their cult and their idols, seeing that he was omnipresent. Yeah, a lot of people make that argument, but that doesn't hold water, because you're still saying that God is not these things. And in fact, there have always been pronounced opponents of this form of pantheism who refuse to permit the Song of Unity to be included in the communal prayer, though it was included already at an early period in the liturgy. Instances of such opposition are related of Rabbi Solomon Luria in the 16th century, and the famous Rabbi Elijah of Vilna, the Gaon of Vilna, in the 18th century. Among the Hasidim, the doctrine of divine eminence persisted after they had come in contact with Spanish Kabbalism, hardly surprising in view of the fact that Kabbalism was by no means free of similar tendencies, including radically pantheistic notions. One of these part Hasidic, part Kabbalistic treatises containing a very illuminating explanation of the description of God as the soul of the soul, in which it is explained that God inhabits the soul. Thus, we are told, is the true meaning of the word, Deuteronomy 7:21, for the Lord thy God is in your midst. The in your midst being a pregnant reference, not to the people, although this is doubtless the meaning of the verse, but to the individual. Thus, with the aid of mystical exegesis, the theory of divine eminence and the conception of God as the inmost grounds of the soul is traced back to the Torah itself, an idea wholly foreign to the Merkabah mystics. This doctrine of a God who, in a mysterious fashion, is immanent in all things, does not always differentiate between the unknown God, the Deus absconditus, and his revelation as king, creator, and sender of prophecy. Frequently, the same designation is applied in both contexts, but side by side with these general theological characteristics of spirituality, infinity, and immanence, there also appears a form of theosophic speculation which attempts to differentiate between the various aspects under which God is revealed, owing